and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third webinar in the series on the effect of COVID-19 on Indigenous peoples' organizations and local communities. Today, we're looking at regulatory rollbacks and the green recovery and how Indigenous peoples are raising their voices. The coronavirus is disproportionately affecting Indigenous peoples and their land rights, particularly those who are already vulnerable as a result of land confiscation and loss of their territories. Expropriation of Indigenous lands and natural resources, and an increase in conflicts were already placing Indigenous people in a precarious position. As governments across the world tackle the coronavirus, they have diluted or scrapped environmental protections, leaving the door wide open for further violations and land grabs. From Peru to the Philippines, Indigenous people and their territories are prime targets. At the same time, countries and communities see the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity for a green and inclusive recovery. There is a growing recognition of the need for investments in renewable energy, the recovery of biodiversity, and the circular economy. Can Indigenous people be a part of the transition to a sustainable green economy? Our panelists today will help us answer this question. We have more than 500 people registered for the panel, so let's get started. You may post questions at any time in the Q&A box, and we will get to them in the last half hour of the discussion. My name is Reena Chandran. I cover land and property rights in Asia for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, the charitable arm of Thomson Reuters. Today we have with us Kirsten Francescone, Mining Watch Canada's program coordinator in Latin America, Nonette Royo, executive director of the Tenure Facility, Roberto Borges, director of the Communities and Territorial Governance Initiative at Forest Trends, and Christina Koch, a Mayan community leader in southern Belize. Beto, can you kick us off and give us a perspective on what's going on in the Amazon, which is the world's hotspot when it comes to Indigenous land rights?
Yes, Rina, good morning and greetings, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I'll share my screen to illustrate some of my points. And here we go, I hope. Can you all see my screen now? So I'm assuming you can see my screen. This situation with the COVID, we've been experiencing a lot of issues in terms of regulatory rollback for Indigenous peoples throughout the world, and in the Amazon where we work, Forest Trends Community Initiative, we've seen witnessing a lot of problems in terms of regulatory rollbacks threatening the rights of Indigenous peoples. I'm focusing in Brazil as an example of the Amazon region, where a lot of Indigenous territories are located, as you can see in the light green. The process of Indigenous land demarcation in Brazil has pretty much been halted since the new administration has been in place, the Bolsonaro government. Not only that, they've tried to change the process of Indigenous land demarcation from the Ministry of Justice to the Ministry of Agriculture. And also have been, and this has been going on for a while, even prior to Bolsonaro, this proposed constitutional amendment, which seeks to prohibit the expansion of already demarcated Indigenous territories in Brazil. At the same time, we've seen a lot of new mining applications. There's also a proposed law to allow mining within Indigenous territories in Brazil. Presently, there are a lot of illegal mining going on in the country. For instance, you must have seen the news around the the Yanomami territory, more than 20,000 illegal miners in the Yanomami territory in Brazil, as an example. In addition to mining and the weakening of indigenous rights in Brazil, that is accompanied by deforestation accelerating throughout the country, throughout the Amazon, not only in Brazil, really moved by illegal logging, the expansion of the agricultural frontier, especially because of soy as well as beef, which results in a lot of violence, murders of indigenous activists, leaders over the years. And also to make things even worse comes fires, another fire season being dramatic in the Amazon as a whole. The Bolsonaro government tried to put a moratorium on fires in the Amazon, but according to NASA, the fires continue despite of the moratorium. And then comes COVID, which it's taking the lives of thousands of people globally, millions almost, unfortunately, at the world level. And in relation to indigenous peoples, it has been a tragedy throughout the Amazon. And in Brazil, we've had, currently we have about 30,000 indigenous peoples affected with COVID, with almost 1,000 deaths, according to the articulation of indigenous peoples in Brazil. So this is the scenario in terms of not only rolling back of the policies, but also ongoing threats to indigenous lands in Brazil. So, but indigenous peoples continue to fight back, really bringing their voices up to the front lines. And how we see this notion of green recovery from the perspective of indigenous peoples is really a call. I'll invite all of us to reflect and contribute, a call to support the governance of indigenous territories. Because when we really look at it, we have 210 million hectares of indigenous lands in the Amazon alone. And the fact is that indigenous lands, as you can see in this map here, there is almost no deforestation, minimal deforestation, average 0.8%, even less than other protected areas, which is 1.1%, and it's significantly lower than surrounding areas elsewhere in the Amazon. A study by Rights and Resources Institute, in fact, has pointed out that deforestation in areas, as you can see in the yellow here in the map, as an example in Brazil, between the two indigenous areas, the Kayapó and Chacrin do Catete, outside of these areas, it's 11 times higher that of deforestation within indigenous territories. And of course, this stewardship of indigenous peoples over their forests results in a great climate contribution, estimates between 42 to 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in terms of avoided emissions. So indigenous lands in Brazil, Brazil has 13% of the Brazilian territory with indigenous peoples as their traditional lands. In fact, there are claims, legitimate claims for twice that amount. And there are 110 million hectares of forests in the hands of indigenous peoples in Brazil, representing 677 indigenous lands with 238 groups speaking 180 distinct languages, which is to say of the beautiful cultural diversity and knowledge and history that we have with indigenous peoples in the country. How does then one go about supporting good governance of indigenous lands? We believe that rights are extremely important, land tenure rights, but rights without good governance, they become vulnerable. And it's extremely important to support indigenous peoples that therefore in their efforts to practice good governance of their forests through supporting their advocacy levels in terms of benefit sharing before the governments around them, also advocacy towards increased climate and conservation finance, so that they can put forth their efforts in terms of establishing better livelihoods through economic self-determination and economic resilience, increase their food security through reestablishing traditional food systems, as well as strengthening their cultural integrity through their tradition. For instance, supporting their traditional health systems, so important now in the face of COVID. Here is one example of how economic activities and this green recovery is taking place in some indigenous areas. So we're one example. We are beginning a campaign to plant, starting with 1 million trees in partnership with Arbor Day, and this will result in increasing carbon storage, also supporting biodiversity, increased food security, and also promoting economic livelihoods through some marketable crops like acai, Brazil nuts, and others. You can check the work of the Xingu Seeds Network that is working with several indigenous territories throughout the Xingu, bringing their indigenous people's traditional science in recuperating degraded lands. And we're working with them to plant 1 million trees, primarily aimed at long-term, medium to long-term economic resilience, as well as food security. In addition, there are several economic enterprises at the community level happening throughout the Amazon. We did a study a couple of years ago with COICA, Ecodecision, and Environmental Defense Fund, looking at several indigenous enterprises, mapping about 126 enterprises throughout the region in 5 countries. And out of those, we found out that 66% are located within the boundaries or buffer zones of 33 protected areas, and also 60 legally demarcated indigenous lands, which represents about over 100 million hectares of forests. Also, a really interesting initiative called Kumari, promoting Amazon gastronomy, connecting indigenous suppliers with prestigious restaurants. This is happening a lot in Peru, where we've seen a lot of interesting work around Amazon gastronomy, which provides income to indigenous peoples. But out of all this work with promoting the economies of indigenous communities is extremely important, really to strike the right balance between that of indigenous traditional economies of reciprocity with the market economy, so that the market economy doesn't come to impact adversely the traditional economies of indigenous peoples. In the same way, efforts to support indigenous cultures in terms of their art, as well as their traditional medicinal plant knowledge, is extremely important. And would emphasize the support of indigenous knowledge in relation to their medicinal plants, the importance of that in the context of COVID. We're working with communities that have not had any infection because they still have a strong knowledge of their medicinal plants. In this example here, the Awanawa people have the knowledge of over 2,000 medicinal plants that they have used traditionally over generations. And finally, my friends, this is a claim or a call to reflection in terms of how can we drive more climate and conservation finance in support of indigenous peoples, good governance, in support of their stewardship of their forests. Again, 210 million hectares of indigenous territories just in the Amazon. The same is true. There are great figures throughout the globe. And here's a snapshot of how the percentage of forest that is tidal for indigenous peoples throughout the region in Bolivia, Brazil, and all those countries. And, and the fact that there is almost no or minimal deforestation in indigenous lands, contributing to climate change, biodiversity conservation. So we have an ongoing program to increase the capacity of indigenous peoples to advocate on their rights, promote economic self-determination, cultural integrity, because more funds is really needed to support good governance and the rights of indigenous peoples. We did a research a few years ago at Forest Strands, and out of $1.2 billion commitments in red, only $378 million were actually allocated to countries, but in reality, almost none of that went towards indigenous peoples directly. So therefore, there is an urgency in funding good governance of indigenous lands, because strong governments, that too is strong governments, but strong governance is really what secure indigenous rights. And thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Beto, for that wake-up call and for the reminder that indigenous people are the best stewards of land and that we are in danger of losing their valuable knowledge. I'm going to turn to Nonette now, who will give us an overview of what's going on in Asia, and particularly Southeast Asia, where conflicts had already been rising before COVID-19 hit. Nonette?
Thank you, Rina. Good afternoon from Stockholm. Good evening to our colleagues in Asia, Southeast Asia, and good morning to our colleagues in North and South America. I'm Nonette Royo, the Executive Director of the Tenure Facility. Before I answer the question, I would like to share my reflection from the webinar takeaways, the first and second of this series. And that is that the trends of rapid change in the name of economic development, even before COVID, has shown that there is increased deforestation that is leading to biodiversity loss and climate instability and our health vulnerability. During COVID, this continues, and indigenous peoples tell us clearly there is no vaccine to deforestation. And that, despite that, they are the most vulnerable and will keep defending the forests. And that, however, we cannot assume that despite their defense and traditional knowledge protecting these territories, that these areas will continue to be protected. The biggest challenge that we face now is the rollbacks, regulation, and what to do legally with indigenous peoples standing up to protect the forests because they are protecting their rights. So I focus on Southeast Asia and Asia, especially the countries that we work with, the Tenure Facility supports with indigenous peoples. In the pandemic, with social distancing and lockdown, apart from vulnerability, the actual public participation in Parliament, for example, in hearings and protests of indigenous peoples themselves, their support groups, and the advocates had been reduced to mainly using social media and active sending of messages directly to lawmakers, parliamentarians, and this had been to no avail. This seems to have given governments a way, this meaning COVID, a way to evade scrutiny and fast-track approvals and bad laws and rollbacks. Several reports from our contacts in Indonesia, India, and Philippines, in Indonesia alone, the COVID, likely because of lockdowns, had increased land grabs and abuse in regulations. Indonesia, between January and September, at least 18 has reported at least 18 incidents of conflict and criminalization in 12 provinces, recorded mainly by the task force set up by WALHI, Indonesia Friends of the Earth member, mostly from expansion and opening of areas for mining, plantation, and oil palm. Many local and indigenous leaders and community members, including women and youth, continue to experience harassment, imprisonment, and murder. In the case in Makassar recently, in Sulawesi, in Indonesia, small islands in Sangkarang, traditional women fishers, the youth, and some of the press members, women especially most vulnerable to COVID, lined up traditional sailboats and fought miners, trawlers, digging up the sand from their fishing zones. The consequence was heavy. Police pursued them and beat up the leaders. This is not unique in this area. Now, policy-wise, Indonesia, the Philippines, and India have the same trends. In Jakarta, the government passed a bill amending the Mining Act, allowing miners to have bigger concessions, larger areas for concession from the limit of 15,000 to double that, and longer contracts, allowing for automatic extension up to 20 more years with less stringent environmental obligations. Mining concessionaires generally close to or within forest areas overlapping local indigenous peoples' control and claimed territories have not paid attention to rights of indigenous peoples. In the Philippines, several mining companies whose licenses have been suspended in 2017 and 2018 by the Ministry of Environment are now back in operation, allowed by the Office of the President. 5 are actively back, 3 are waiting to be back soon. Some of these concessions, again, overlap indigenous territories. In India, it's the same. Environmental impact assessment law in 2020 eases the process of doing business for specific projects, especially those with linked to national interests and infrastructure, taking away, again, requirement for public hearings and extending, again, the same type in Philippines and Indonesia, terms up to 50 years of these concessionaires. It also opens expansion for infrastructure projects affecting parks, protected areas, reserves, likely affecting indigenous peoples. So these trends ask us very important questions. What kind of joint action is possible? By whom? What kind of legal protection is required? And what kind of safeguards? The approach of securing land rights based on existing laws and regulations that the Tenure Facility has used to support directly indigenous peoples and local community actors to build the evidence to protect themselves legally and customarily is at hand. It's now going on in regions in Africa and also in Latin America, not just in Asia. This is most felt, especially now, and it is also most useful to learn from, because it's not just indigenous peoples and local communities that are affected. It is every one of us, and the rollback seems to directly affect them and the environment, but not the other sectors that are experiencing difficulties in COVID. So I'll stop here and turn it over to the next speaker, who will tell us more about that role, the advocacy role. Thank you.
Thanks, Nanette. Rather sobering to realize that governments can be so quick and efficient in rolling back regulations that can take years to implement and a lot of advocacy to achieve. We will hear from Kirsten next. Kirsten, can you give us an overview of what you are seeing and hearing?
Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm gonna just give a quick overview of what we saw in the pandemic with respect specifically to the mining industry. Mining Watch Canada is an organization here based out of Ottawa, and we worked collaboratively with the organizations that you can see on the screen. So Terra Justa, the Institute for Policy Studies, War on Want, Yes to Life, No to Mining, Earthworks, and the Lending Mining Network, in collaboration with all of our sort of partners from the Asia Pacific region, Latin America, North America, and the Oceania Pacific region, to sort of map out what the mining industry was doing during the pandemic, when we started to look at, for example, reports in the media that was showing that the mining industry was donating test kits, or that the mining industry was engaging in donations to hospitals. But our reports from our partners on the ground was quite different about what the mining industry had been doing during the pandemic at the beginning. And so we started to become quite concerned and started looking for trends that could be considered quote unquote global trends, with respect to how the industry from our perspective was taking advantage of the pandemic to continue to profit, and obviously in doing so putting communities and their working populations at extreme risk. And so the methodology that we use, and I will note that these numbers and this methodology is old, it's now out of date. We know that the pandemic is just, it's starting in around June, really exploded in Latin America. It's just sort of showing its ugly face in many of these countries with whom we're working with partners. And so the data, the picture is surely much worse than it was when we did the original collecting, which was between March and June of this year. So we revised around 500 media sources or community statements, journalist reportings or social media statements. And of those 500 sources, we collected data from about 47 countries. And 180 of those 500 were directly linked to community or worker concerns about either their health and well-being or about other mechanisms, which I'll talk to right now about the 4 trends. And so from that database, from that 180 cases, we identified sort of 4 global trends, and basically showed within those 4 trends that indeed there was a pattern of profiteering going on between the mining industry, and that we identified within that pattern of profiteering these 4 trends, which I'm going to talk about one by one, which I think are sort of relevant, and we'll say that some of the panelists have already touched on them to some extent this morning. And so the first that we identified is that mining companies are ignoring the real threats of the pandemic and are continuing to operate using any means available. And so we were following mining companies, particular mining companies, who were continuing to operate despite the fact that there were outbreaks emerging around especially the very rural communities within which they are working, or that they were in fact provoking outbreaks and failing to shut down. This is especially true in cases where governments fail to implement very strong restriction measures to the sector immediately, right? And so in many cases, what happened is that governments classified mining as a quote unquote essential service, which enabled them essentially to continue working as normal while communities were forced to lock down, while workers were forced to stay on site, or mining was sort of continued to was allowed to continue as normal. And in doing so, the mining sector itself became sort of like a vector of spreading. And we know, if we know anything about mining, we know that many of these mines are located in rural communities, alongside Indigenous communities, in places where there's already very scarce, if any, access to basic healthcare or sanitation conditions, right? And so the fact that these mines were serving to become vectors meant that these communities that may have been able to protect themselves because of their isolation, because of their own measures, were being forced to be exposed to this virus. And so the results of this sort of essential status, or this special status that was given to the sector, was actually quite striking and concerning. We registered outbreaks in over 61 mines in 18 countries, and that amounted at the time to about 4,000 workers. 2 days after this data was concluded, we doubled that number. It became almost 8,000 workers because of reported spreads in Poland and Russia. At least 250 community or family-related infections were reported because of mine-related vector spread, and at least 10 workers died, and at least 4 community members, all of those Indigenous, died because of contact with the mining at a mine and with the spread of the virus. And so some quick emblematic cases here in Canada, in northern Alberta, there was an oil sands mine which was given special status. They continued to work operations as normal, even as 45 of their workers became infected. And that outbreak triggered a series of infections across 3 provinces and led to the death of 2 Indigenous Dene elders in the neighboring province of Saskatchewan. In the case of Antamina in Peru, we saw that despite the fact that workers were telling their bosses that they had an outbreak at the mine, the management denied it. And we ended up with 210 workers infected and at least 1 worker reported dead. And perhaps the most egregious of these cases is Cobre Panama in Panama, which is a Canadian company, First Quantum Minerals, where the mine continued to operate despite a massive and widespread outbreak, and was only shut down because the Ministry of Health ordered them to shut down. And we had nearly 7 workers and over nearly 500 workers, and 7 were dead after that outbreak took hold of the mine, right? And so, as we can see from a chief here of the Alliance of First Nations in Quebec and Labrador here in Quebec, the Indigenous organization in that part of the country, in the face of COVID-19, our leaders prioritize the health and safety of our members above everything else, even the economy. And this was in response to the Quebec government revoking or giving the mining sector special status so that they continue to operate after having revoked their status for several months. The next trend that we saw, and this, one of our panelists, Nonette, has just sort of spoken on this, is that we've seen that especially pro-mining governments around the world have been shutting down legitimate protests and promoting the mining sector, right? And so we know that a lot of these extractive projects have already been met with quite strong organized resistance for many years. Some of that resistance requires people to be peacefully, for example, like in the case that you're seeing in the photo, maintaining peaceful encampments to prevent mine operations from, continuing or resuming. And so what we saw is that in a lot of these countries, particularly in South America and Southeast Asia, governments had imposed restrictions on the freedom of movement of people while letting mining companies continue to operate. And also there was an increase in sort of criminalization and militarization of these sort of land defending operations or activities in order to benefit the mining sector. And so the emblematic case that I'm showing in the photo is the case of the Didipio mine in the Philippines, where the peaceful encampment that had been established for over 6 months was violently evicted by the Duterte government with the excuse that they were violating sanitary procedures, even though the encampment had taken all of the necessary procedures. You can see in the photos they're wearing masks, they were socially distancing, but we can see that the pandemic provided a perfect opportunity to really sort of violently evict that encampment. And that wasn't the only case of violent evictions. We also saw that in Turkey, where again, another sort of peaceful encampment against another gold mine was also violently evicted, in both cases citing COVID-19 sanitary measures. In Ecuador, we saw public officials, police officers, firefighters, and even a city council person arrested by the police for stopping mining trucks from entering their province because they were worried about the spread of the virus, because we know that these mining companies have executives that are flying all over the world and bringing people into contact. And in both cases in Mexico and Colombia, we've seen, an incremental increase in the already tragic ongoing targeting and assassination of land defenders, journalists, people that are reporting on the atrocities of the mining sector or are attempting to protect their lands from the potential disaster that it provokes. The third trend that we saw is that mining companies are using the pandemic as an opportunity to cover up their dirty track records and present themselves as these public-minded saviors. And this is what we really saw in the media. This is the piece that we saw publicly, despite the fact that nobody was talking about outbreaks at mines. All of the mainstream media was talking about how wonderful all of a sudden Vale, for example, was in donating 1 million test kits in Brazil. Vale, the same sort of company that's responsible for the criminal and tragic ruptures of 2 tailings dams within the last 5 years that have had, exponentially significant impacts to health and the environment in Brazil, no? And so we started seeing that these companies were taking advantage of a little bit of space to, to promote themselves and to sort of try to clean up their images. And so again, this is a really great quote from partners of ours in Guatemala. COVID-19 isn't the only health crisis that we're facing. For a decade, communities surrounding the Escobal mine have fought to protect their health from mining activities. The Guatemalan government and Pan American Silver, the company, was ordered to suspend its consultation, and this includes community outreach, which gives rise to tension and conflict. Pan American Silver should tell its employees to stay home and stop trying to buy support from the mine during the significant health crisis, right? And so we saw that, Barrick Gold was making, known for egregious human rights violations, was making sizable cash donations to several African governments as COVID relief, despite the fact that those cash payments were being made to the Ministry of Mines, right? Vale, as I just mentioned, Pan Am, who's supposed to be, suspended in this, not intervening in this consultation process, all of a sudden was found giving out foodstuffs, right? And in the case of Newcrest Mining, a large Australian mining company that's tied to several health and environmental violations in several countries around the world, was donating millions to vaccine research, right? And so this is the image that the media was telling us, but obviously from our partners' perspectives, it was yet another layer of the kinds of manipulations of the press, for example, that communities have to face in order to continue their struggle. And finally, the last tendency pattern that we saw was that mining companies and governments were using the crisis to secure regulatory changes that favor the industry at the expense of people and the planet. And this is, I think, sort of the crux of what's next to come. This is the fear for us as a group of organizations is how permanent these supposed temporary changes are going to become. There's been a withering away at the already weak regulatory system that exists to protect environments in what little way they can, to protect environments and communities from the extreme impacts that the mining industry has on people in the environment. But there's also been a stripping away of public participation processes and civil liberties, for example. And so what we were seeing is that also things like the free and prior consultation processes that are required for Indigenous peoples in several countries were being all of a sudden talked about being held online or being held virtually. We know that that causes very particular problems for communities that are isolated, may not have access to a phone or internet, right? A shrinking of the spaces that are already sort of really limited for community participation and engagement. And so, an emblematic case for us is in Indonesia, where a very contested mining law that had been stalled for over a year was passed during the pandemic without public participation. In Brazil, where the government has cited the pandemic, and this also is true in Canada, cited the pandemic as the perfect opportunity to open up Indigenous lands to mining, right, and to totally dismantle their environmental regulation and environmental monitoring system for that country. And in Canada, here in Canada, one of our provincial leaders said that the pandemic was a perfect opportunity to build a pipeline that has been very contested by First Nations and other community organizations in Canada for many years. And so, as I mentioned, just to conclude, I think our biggest sort of concern today is how permanent these changes become and how normalized, or what the new normal is going to look like. And I think that there's a lot of work being done now by community organizations to sort of call that out and say that this is not what we want for the future, especially a future, that's embroiled in an ecological crisis and obviously the current climate crisis. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Kirsten, for that sobering overview of what's been going on. And a reminder, really, that COVID isn't the only health crisis that communities are facing, and that this crisis is being used as a front by mining companies to clean up their acts, or at least pretend to clean up their acts. After all of that rather depressing after those depressing views, I'm going to turn over to Christina now, who as a community leader had already been working on a path forward for the Indigenous community even before COVID. Christina, would you like to tell us about what is happening with that plan and how you see COVID as an opportunity or a crisis to get around?
Thank you, and good morning from Belize. The Maya of southern Belize, the Ekchi, the people that I am from, and the Mopan Maya have had a long history of collective action to sustain life, land, and community. In the face of oppression and exclusion, we have demonstrated much resilience, resourcefulness, creativity, and the capacity to act and persevere. With this pandemic, social distancing, state of emergency regulations, lockdowns, a failing labor economy, crippling tourism industries, the indigenous people of Belize, the Maya people, have continued to demonstrate this very resilience. The pandemic is a threat to life, but this experience is not new to indigenous peoples. Considering our historical and continued struggles for life, land, justice, and equality. In fact, many of us are with possible death threats, as you've heard from various speakers. As we defend our territory, our waters, our land against illegal loggers, oil companies, and narcos. As you're hearing from previous speakers, this is now exacerbated by COVID-19. In this webinar, I am asked to focus on how indigenous communities can benefit and how they can contribute to the global effort to scale up a green recovery, to scale up investments and financing, and transition to just and sustainable green economies. To this end, I want to share the struggle of my people in defense of their lands and territories, their dreams and vision for their lands and their future as they contend with many challenges, including rising temperatures, overexploitation of natural resources, climate change, and now COVID-19. Perhaps the most poignant demonstration of our resilience and unwavering spirit of survival is the struggle that we now engage to defend our lands. For decades, we have raised our voices in and outside of court. We have organized ourselves. We have dreamt of a more just world. We have built strategic partnerships. And one very well-known result of this struggle has been the historical achievement of a consent order by the Caribbean Court of Justice in 2015, where it affirmed Maya land rights. It has always been clear to us, however, that the struggle for land rights is only a part of a larger struggle. This larger struggle is to secure a place for the Maya people to be and for the Maya people to be well. It is a struggle for our way of life. It's not different from the struggle of many other indigenous peoples in Belize and abroad who fight for a dignified future, a sustainable future. In deliberating over how we confront the opportunities and challenges ahead, a process to collectively envision new routes and pathways for the future was born among my people. Following the teaching of the sacred Popol Vuh, we came together to dialogue and to arrive at consensus. This process articulated a collective vision brought together by Maya women, youth, men, community leaders from a wide cross-section of our community. We began by examining our own ways of understanding the world and ourselves. This is so that we remain rooted as we explored new routes. To do this, we examined 3 questions. Who are we as Maya people? What are our pains? What are our illnesses? What are the things that make us unwell that must be attended to? What are our strengths that make us resilient and are the foundations upon which we can build a future? We ventured to paint a dream on a canvas. One could almost say literally, because we mostly did this through drawings and illustrations. For context, we recognize that often Indigenous peoples like ourselves are represented as poor, broken and passive, or quaint and exotic, or a people stuck in the past, not modern enough, a people standing in the way of development and progress, or a people incapable of living in the mainstream. However, the drawings and the words that emerged from examining who we are communicated something very different. It expressed that we are a strong people who know who we are, who are connected to our land and have the responsibility to care for it. It expressed that we are also knowledgeable and capable, not afraid of hard work, who value peace, unity, and community. Just to summarize our interpretation of drawings in response to this question from the various sectors of our community. Who are we? The youth, their drawings tell us that we are people who live and depend on the land. They drew food, corn, chickens, cacao. It also tells us that the Maya people have a long history on the land and explained that the Maya are intelligent and creative and come from a great civilization known for these very characteristics. They drew Maya temples. The youth also drew and communicated identity, our own ways and culture. They drew this by showing their cultural dress, the musical instruments. The women, through their drawings, stressed the concept of Ralchoch, the Kekchi term that means people of the land. This is how we identify ourselves as Kekchi people. We are people who live, work, and depend on and care for the land. Women illustrated this relationship with the land vividly through their drawings, doing laundry in the creeks, fishing in the rivers. They also expressed that the land provides food. They showed this through drawings of chickens, their herb gardens, their corn, their beans. Women spoke often and proudly about producing their own food. They also depicted, through their drawings, an identity. Women emphasized their relationship to corn and the processing of corn. Their drawings complemented the central element to our identity, the notion of Ralchoch, the people of the land. The men emphasized in their drawings the importance of interdependence and reciprocity. A great way they showed this is by drawing Maya people thatching their house with palm leaves from the forest. To build a home in Toledo, you rely on the existence of a community of support. You rely on the dignity of being able to give and help others and the humility and gratitude of receiving help. What is given and received is not only collective labor, but also the knowledge and the commitment that we are in this together. At the same time, the men's drawings hinted at the relationship with the forest, the materials, the palm, the strings, the sticks for building homes come from the forest. The drawings of men, much like the women, also emphasize the notion of Ralchochness. It speaks to our relationship to the land that provides us with food and materials for our existence. The land is not only our home, it is also the home of other beings that are equally important. They highlighted our collective labor, our knowledge exchange, and the way these come together with the land to sustain us. However difficult it was to capture the totality and the complexity of these expressions in words, we conclude that we are not a monolithic or a static people. In other words, there are many ways to be Maya, to be indigenous. And what it means to be Maya changes as we traverse through time and confront new realities. What we hold for certain is that we are a people both diverse and united. We found all these elements of who we are to be consistent to what our strengths are. As we examined our pains and the threats that we must confront, we articulated the following. We identified land, culture, leadership, and unity as being important strengths. At the same time, this same land, unity, and culture is under extreme pressure. Some of these pressures include external divisive forces, such as religion, politics, foreign interests. However, we also recognize that there are internal factors, such as poor leadership, local people wanting to sell land, even sectors of the Mayan community who do not agree with communal land vision. However, our people have never stopped dreaming and acting to bring our dreams to fruition. The fact that we exist to this day, even when history tries to erase us, the very affirmation of the Caribbean Court of Justice of our rights to land is the result of a dream. We dared to dream that we could raise our voices, join our hands, and achieve justice, even when everyone thought it was impossible. Today, armed with the confidence of knowing who we are and a critical awareness of our strengths and our pains, along with the confidence that we will meet friends and allies on our path, we dare to continue to dream. In this global lockdown, the lockdown of Indigenous territories, of Indigenous peoples, is perhaps the best way to survive this global pandemic. In light of collapsing economies, food, employment insecurity faced by many around the world, Indigenous peoples, Maya peoples, are producing and sharing foods on their lands. So while states struggle to roll out their employment relief, their food pantries, Indigenous peoples are the last to be reached in these efforts. Our history and our struggle have taught us that we are alone, that our historical umbilical relationship to the land, our waters and our territories, is what will continue to deliver on our survival. Many are returning to the land, to Indigenous ways, to Indigenous production and food sovereignty. A green recovery, therefore, could not be imagined without supporting Indigenous people's struggles, defense of lands, resources, territory, and dignified futures. Investing in Indigenous governance, land tenure defense, promoting Indigenous economies and innovations of reciprocity is a green recovery. Summarize, the future we dream as the Maya of Southern Belize is to be a peaceful, hardworking, self-determining people rooted in our culture, open to the world and new technologies, living in community and stewarding the well-beings of our people and our lands. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christina, for that very positive commentary. So there is hope in the world after all. Before we go to questions, and a reminder again that you can post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Clearly and sadly, money makes the world go round, and there have been cutbacks to funding for Indigenous peoples' organizations. So I want to ask Beto and Nonette, are you seeing, where is funding coming from for any of the Indigenous programs and for community efforts? Beto, do you want to go first?
Sure, Rina, thank you for the question. Well, there are different funding streams that over the years has come to a certain extent to Indigenous peoples. You know, bilateral aid agencies, foundations, and some NGOs that actually rechannel funding. That of sort of philanthropic funding, if you will. There's also more recently funding streams that come as a result of Indigenous people's own economic activities, which it's quite interesting as well, because there they have more of a participation into the development of those particular efforts. However, as I pointed out earlier, the funding level that comes directly to Indigenous peoples, and I would emphasize the importance of funding Indigenous organizations at the territorial level, that is, organizations that are the legitimate representatives of territories. They're representing their community at the territorial level. Although it's also important to support Indigenous organizations that that act at more of the policy political level. I think, so a lot of the RED, in the case of climate finance, a lot of the RED funding and climate funding, a lot of it goes to governments. And we haven't yet seen really effective benefit sharing programs by the local governments, be it in the Amazon and elsewhere, that channels a significant portion of that funding that these governments are receiving from a major bilateral aid agencies going to indigenous peoples. There is an interesting case, funding from Norway and Germany through the RED Early Movers program, where we've seen some movement towards that, although the percentages that actually get finally arrive at the territorial level fails before the whole amount that has been that is going to the RED Early Movers program. I mean, in Ecuador, we've seen also more progress through the Social Bosque program. But I think, and I will close my comment now with one reflection that we've been observing over the years working with philanthropy. In fact, I used to work with philanthropy myself. And I think that is kind of a level of mistrust still, or not trusting enough indigenous organizations that can manage their own funds. And and I think it's necessary for funding institutions also to think out of the box, because the way in which funding is channeled to indigenous organizations really has been set up from the metrics of a Western society, like a lot of monitoring evaluation. Not that that is not important, but oftentimes these metrics, these allocation systems or disbursement systems, they're not culturally appropriate. Therefore, over the years, we've been witnessing with a lot of sadness that indigenous organizations cannot respond to the expectations of Western thought, in the box ways of measuring performance, when in reality, we see 210 million hectares in the stewardship of indigenous peoples. What better performance do we need? I mean, so I think there is a disconnect between how funding is flowing or not flowing, but also the little bit that flows to indigenous peoples that we've seen in the state of Acre in Brazil. I was very involved with that process myself. Was ill-conceived in terms of how it was disbursed, not culturally appropriate. I think there's a lot to be improved there.
Great. Perhaps we can get the audience to engage on new ways of funding that are more appropriate for indigenous people. Nanette, do you have something to add about funding mechanisms that you're seeing? And what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, and thank you, Beto, for pointing those out. It's really important. But before talking about financing, just about financing, and lest we lose ourselves in the need for more funding, it's important to, listening to Christina, to really look at what indigenous peoples already have, are plentiful, and that we funders don't have. And this perspective is really important. Indigenous peoples already have their own intergenerational practices in their culture, their inherent value for respect, mutuality, interdependence with nature, their traditional knowledge that is inherent sustainability right there. They already have their soils, their forest groves, those that cannot be planted, but are really grown and ancient, and integrated ecosystems. They have land, they have territory, they have, and they're already organized to protect each other, to protect us, because we need the forests and all beings in nature that they consider brothers and sisters. These are assets, especially key, and without which we cannot green development, and are a major pillar to green recovery. So financial mechanisms should be and can be designed to focus on supporting what they already have. That includes the importance of defining where they are and where their land rights are. And in that way, they can keep doing what they already do that we need. What is currently doable in supporting existing work of forest guardians and forest protectors is really that kind of funding, that which values community, that which transforms lifestyles, to really look at the world right now as we see it. And this COVID has shown us what we don't have and what we've forgotten. So these Indigenous peoples partners, Christina's one of them, really important, are not going to become conventional project holders and skilled project implementers. Then the other thing that I would like to emphasize is science has already flooded the public recently with key information that guardianship of forests by Indigenous peoples is key to address climate change. And this is identified, for example, in the global safety net analysis just recently came out, which is that it is a safety net that the world's needs to survive is to conserve 50% of the terrestrial land in the world to reverse biodiversity loss and prevent carbon emissions from land conversion and enhance natural carbon removal. Now, what is the estimate? This is just quickly I will share, is that only now we have just 15.1% of that important terrestrial landscape, which means that the world needs to conserve additional land areas to halt biodiversity loss and stabilize climate. That Indigenous peoples' lands and territories would be what will be needed to meet that global safety net, and where they are already protecting these lands. Dinerstein and company produce this. So financing Indigenous peoples or green economy means financing Indigenous people's support for their land rights, which is what's necessary for the negotiations to determine solutions. All of us need it, the governments need it, private sector need it. And this can be what is the aspirational funding for supporting Indigenous peoples. There are many programs in the World Bank, in bilateral agencies in UNDP. All of these are well intended. The biggest challenge is how do we do this without transforming that which already Indigenous peoples do very well. That really is what I would like to emphasize in this financing. Yes, do it, let's do it, and there's funding, but how do we do it such that we support those that are in the front lines?
Thanks, Nanette. Perhaps Christina can weigh in on this. I mean, we've heard from Beto and Nanette that a lot of the funding is not appropriate and that it's measured with outdated methods. How do you think it should be structured, Christina?
Well, I wanted to add my voice to this just to say that often what we see is that while these financing mechanisms might have good intentions and might want to reach the Indigenous communities, what we find is that a lot of times they come through agreements and arrangements with states that we have historically been in contention with. And so a lot of these financing mechanisms do not amount to really supporting what is already taking place by Indigenous peoples on the ground. Perhaps one of the good examples of how Indigenous peoples can best be supported. For instance, right now, the Maya Leaders Alliance, Toledo Alcaldes Association, Indigenous Society, the organizations that I represent, are being supported to implement the consent order of the court through the Land Tenure Facility. And just the way that this funding was set up is so that it could leverage Indigenous people's position who are often without the resources to pursue this implementation. We might have recognized rights, but if you don't have the resources to pressure the state to live to this obligation, then you are basically shelving very good decisions from courts. And so this ability to support Indigenous people, to leverage states that have the resources, that have the capacity, is critical to see the full and effective enjoyment of those rights and the protection of those lands and territories. And I think that there is no other way but to reconsider how financing is done so that it actually reaches the Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. We must get to our patient participants now. There's a bunch of questions. Let me just get to those in order. Beto, there's a couple of questions for you. So you referred to the possible contradictions between promoting income and market engagement and respecting or not undermining Indigenous people's cultures. Could you say more about strategies for doing this? And a second question is, could you provide more details about experiences and achievements of economic self-determination and cultural integrity? Beto?
Sure, thank you, Rina. Really the best way to go about finding the right balance between Indigenous economic traditional economies with that of the market economy is really through promoting, supporting their reflective processes in ways that traditional systems are not replaced with the market demand. Finding that the right balance, it's quite difficult. We've been working over years now, and some of my colleagues are here with me, and where oftentimes essentially there are two realities, especially when you have Indigenous communities really in remote parts of the globe, the Amazon, in our case, working in the Amazon, and all the transaction costs that make viable a particular product that comes from these communities, and the need for the marketplace really for ensuring quality control, pricing, and so on and so forth. That a lot of pressure as a result comes on top of these communities that are not quite yet prepared to bring their products to market. So there have been, fortunately, some experiences where we and many other people working in this field are able to work with Indigenous peoples and local communities to overcome some of these barriers, such as transaction costs, quality control, but all along there needs to be continuous reflection at Indigenous assemblies levels with the whole participation of Indigenous communities through their leadership, so that some of these economic opportunities that they are developing also do not only benefit just a few people within the community. So one way to really avoid the adverse impact of the market economy coming into the Indigenous people's own traditional economies is really that a process is in place where the co-participation of as many members of the communities as possible throughout generations, through gender, that the value of money is really discussed. To what extent that money is going to be used, in what way, is it going to be used to support life plans, to support good governance and livelihoods? Because the reality, Rina and my friends, is that if we do not engage with Indigenous peoples that are seeking connections with the market economy, they are pretty much left on their own. And the fact is that more and more unsound development is encroaching upon Indigenous territories. And if they do not develop their own economy, their own self-determined economy, they will continue to fall vulnerable to the unsound forces of development, and such as leasing Indigenous lands for cattle ranching, just allowing illegal miners or illegal loggers to come into their territories. They do need access to the market economy. but it needs to be based on free prior informed consent. It needs to be based on an integrated approach that supports their good living, that supports the good governance of their lands.
Thank you, Beto. There's a question, I guess, for all panelists. Which area of regulatory rollback do you think is of greatest concern? And what have you seen that has given you a sign of hope for the future during the pandemic? I think that part of the question has been answered. But what area of regulatory rollback do you think is of greatest concern?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think what is very apparent in the current initial review of regulatory rollback is the rollback on basic rights, and this is really due process, and that is a basic. You cannot roll that back. It is constitutional rights, and this is notice and hearing. So hearing has been shortcut in many places now in extending, for example, the processes for environmental impact assessments, environmental and social, and that hearing is part of due process, and that is and that's for FPIC. So that is very much prominent in what I'm seeing, and the right to information as well, because you shortcut it, you don't allow people to read material or and understand what is the implication. So those to me are from where what I've seen, and what giving us sign of hope. I think that was discussed. So,
yeah.
Indigenous people.
Kirsten, do you want to add to the what rollbacks are you most concerned about question?
Yeah, I would agree with Nanette that the due process rollback is probably the most concerning, especially around issues of participation and access to information. I think the other is to what extent can the already weak sort of regulatory mechanisms around environmental contamination, environmental monitoring be stripped away and removed, right? I mean, right now in the US, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, suspended all environmental monitoring. That's happened at the provincial wide level in Canada. In Brazil, we're seeing like lots of discussion about how to, extend those quote unquote frontiers, right? Or make the environmental regulation process less quote unquote bureaucratic, more open to business. And so I do really feel that the gains made perhaps around environmental monitoring and the recognition that large-scale extractive industries like forestry, like mining, like oil and gas have tremendous impacts on the environment that need to be monitored and taken note of will be stripped away, right? Because I think the bigger question about companies positioning themselves as essential for the economic recovery of our economies is going to imply that then they need a sort of a rollback, a facilitation for business, right? Like making business easier so that they can be the saviors of our economic recovery, right? And so usually the first regulations to go are environmental regulations and our sort of processual, sort of like the sort of social gains that we've won over the past 20 or 30 years, right? And so I think there is some real concern that companies will be able to successfully argue that it's just too expensive to continue to do their environmental monitoring. And if we really need them to recover the economy, then this is what we're gonna have to, this is the cost we're gonna have to pay.
Okay, thanks, Kirsten. There's a question on how can Indigenous peoples' organizations, networks, and community developers be directly involved in projects on land rights and livelihood development for their communities? Is that even possible? Who would like to take that question?
A section of that, yeah. There's an assumption here that, and it's very important, we all do this and we'll think this way. Sometimes when the processes are there already and there's development, that we are thinking of how are Indigenous peoples benefited and how can they participate? We have to reverse that thinking and essentially put forward the fact that these resources, land and natural, are protected, managed, and used for generations by Indigenous peoples. Therefore, they cannot just benefit. They have to participate as rights holders. And therefore, there are processes, you know, in different countries, probably different types, where rights holders participate from the beginning. And none of these constitutional laws actually can prohibit that. So at district, at village levels, participate already. And yes, look and find out what the processes are, but with that thinking that indigenous peoples, local communities are participants and rightful holders, and to join the thinking of what type of development will be built, especially in this new normal. It's been very clear. So the thinking that, yeah, they're beneficiaries, we consult them. They are like, you know, we have to list them as people that will then get some compensation. That's got to be rethought. I guess that's how I would like to see, you know, this question framed.
Thanks, Nanette. There's a question on the green and just recovery from Delphin. What could be the 3 most important aspects of a just recovery, especially for Indigenous peoples? Beto, Nanette, does anybody want to take that?
Christina, maybe.
Maybe I can speak to that.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, Christina.
I think fundamentally we have to, I want to echo what Nanette has already so clearly articulated, is that we have to change the perspective from which we view and the lens from which we view Indigenous people. We are not underdeveloped. We are not scattered and disorganized. We are not lazy people. We are hardworking. We have organized ourselves. We know how to mobilize our resources. And I think fundamentally the most important way for a green recovery, a just recovery, is to recognize and respect Indigenous people's contribution to the sustainable and balanced way of living one with Earth. I want to emphasize again, and I can only go to my own contextual identity, which is that we are Ralchoch, and Indigenous peoples globally have different expressions of this Ralchochness that I speak about. We are the people of the land. We are connected in this umbilical way to our land and to our resources. And without recognizing that, without changing the way we perceive Indigenous peoples, when we always see them as people standing in the way of progress or blocking oil companies, or blocking massive large-scale logging concessions, we will always miss the opportunity to really advance what Indigenous peoples have already contributed and continue to contribute to the survival of this planet. You can look, we've seen the data all over that shows, that evidence the fact that where we live is where the most forested and ecologically sound areas continue to exist. We live one with nature. And this is not to romanticize what Indigenous peoples have, because we have our challenges internally and externally. But for us to consider a truly green recovery, and perhaps one of the biggest things that this pandemic has shown us is that it has further unraveled and shone a light on the various marginalizations of Indigenous people. And perhaps what we can do is that when we rebuild our economy, when we recover our industries, how do we do it better? How do we do it in a more inclusive way? How do we learn from Indigenous people's experiences? And if we cannot contend with those issues, then we are not on the path to a green recovery.
Thank you, Christina. A reminder to participants to please take the survey before you leave. It will only take a minute. We're not quite done yet. We have a couple more questions to get through, but you can answer the survey in the meantime as well. There's a question from Robin. To what extent can we combine the legal and economic approaches to engage non-state actors while simultaneously strengthening and expanding pre-existing advocacy networks. Who would like to take that? Beto, do you want to give that a go? Engaging non-state actors.
Well, I was hoping to speak of state actors based on the previous
Well, you
question.
can. I'm sure that would be appreciated as well.
But yeah, though, I think maybe I can try to make a link between non-state and state actors. Non-state actors engaging with civil society in support, first of all, recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples. For us NGOs not to speak on behalf of indigenous peoples, to respect that indigenous peoples can speak for themselves. And for state actors to really, in many countries, there are already a lot of good legislation in place, not to roll back, one of the main highlights of this webinar. So in the case of Brazil, for instance, in the Article 231 of the Brazilian Constitution, indigenous peoples not only have their rights to their territories, but they have the rights to the exclusive use of the natural resources within their territories. So, and I think that needs to be respected, that needs to be included in any new normal or new, I don't like this new normal, I think what we had before wasn't normal, the new era of environmental justice that we need to live in the world. And that really, we need to have state actors really respecting what non-state actors have to say. And really, because a lot of what we've seen being done that actually is making a difference in supporting indigenous advocacy efforts has been done by indigenous peoples themselves and civil society. Civil society organizations there for many years, they have been doing the job of what state actors should be doing. And I think that that we need to see better integration of that. So, and again, non-state actors, the funding community, I think the funding community could also, like I said earlier, seek to find innovative ways to see that finance go to good governance of indigenous lands, goes more so directly to support indigenous rights to their lands.
Kirsten, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's always challenging to engage with non-state actors, especially when non-state actors are, you know, in many cases, from our perspective, sometimes criminal actors, right? Or you know, companies that are, you know, engaging in violent and egregious abuses. I think that with Beto, I think the sort of, from our perspective, at least at Mining Watch, and for several of the organizations that form part of this coalition, the push has always been to demand stronger regulatory reforms, stronger state, you know, engage with the state to have stronger state level governance mechanisms, as opposed to voluntary standards or non-binding mechanisms that often come from engaging with industry, right? I think there's a real challenge because of the economic model that governs a lot of these industries, to think that they themselves are going to be those that push the change that we need to see, and push it at the scale and the sort of with the speed that we need to see it. And of course, there's always challenges too from our partners themselves, who often don't want to engage with those non-state actors, right? That they just don't see that as even something that they want to do. And so I think, yeah, I think the challenge is also to mobilize ourselves, right? I think the way that we get state change is through mobilization at a more popular and widespread level, right? And not hope that industry or sort of private bodies are going to do that for us, right? I think we have to be, we've seen for many years now that that's actually not what's happening. And it's actually perpetuating or increasing, from the mining sector at least, increasing the levels of extraction, you know, the whole transition through for example, the energy transition metals, right? The transition away from a low carbon economy is now a mining intensive transition to a low carbon economy. And so I think if we let the industry lead those processes, if we engage with them and think that they're going to be the leaders in that process, then we can end up perpetuating the ecological crisis or perhaps exacerbating it in ways that we didn't perhaps foresee, right? So I think there's real challenges with thinking about how those engagements can happen in ways that would gel with not a whole sort of change of the economic model and the economic system within which we live, right? Which is predatory, which is discriminatory, which is definitely destroying our environments.
I think this will have to be our last question, sadly, but perhaps end on a more positive note. Given advances on legislation in terms of rights of nature, for example, in Bolivia, Ecuador, New Zealand, what type of actions, I guess regulatory actions, could be promoted to support green recovery? Who wants to take that? Nanette, do you want to take that?
Yes, it is actors that are grounded in land, territory, practice, knowledge are very important components to any kind of green recovery. So they are key, and they're people and they're citizens and they're stakeholders, and they are also non-state actors, and they are also private entities themselves. So it's really important to take that into account, and from a perspective of real learning that is inclusive. Real learning, I mean learning from what we're experiencing right now. There's so many new things that have come up in what we've experienced right now with this pandemic that hasn't come up before. And therefore, if we try to attempt to build forward, not build back, because back means we've created the same problems that we've built before, we need to ground it. And a very important knowledge base and experience base that's going to help us is from the real stakeholders themselves. And that's really where I think we can do. Yeah.
Maybe I could add a little bit to the legislation on nature's rights and protection of nature. I think that we cannot dismiss the fact that Indigenous peoples have been the voice of nature. We have promoted its protection, its stewardship, and often we are seen as against the state as a people, but really the assault on our lands, the assault on our rivers, the assault on our forest. The forest can't speak for itself. The rivers can't speak for themselves. It is the very people who are the stewards of those places that have spoken for Mother Nature. And I think that you cannot dismiss the fact that the only way that these legislation can be promoted and can be effective is to recognize the Indigenous stewardships of these territories. So I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Christina. Sadly, it's time for us to wrap up. A big thank you to our panelists and to our very engaged audience. I do apologize if we did not manage to get through all of your questions. These are tough times for Indigenous peoples, but as we have heard, there are many, many reasons to be optimistic about a fairer, more sustainable future, one that gives Indigenous peoples their due. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you all so much. That's